Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this special broadcast about Stress Awareness Month. I'm Anne Franca. I'm the Chief Executive of the Chartered Management Institute, CMI, and we know that many of you are very interested in this topic. We've had a record number of, I think over 2,000 of you have expressed interest and signed up. So welcome. I am delighted to welcome as my guest to discuss this Dr. Lynne Green, who is the Chief Clinical Officer of Kooth, and that is the UK's leading mental health service, and we'll come back to talk more about that, and Louise Powell, who is the Head of Partner Development and Apprenticeships for Specsavers. Welcome to both of you. Now, there is a little bit of a preamble. We know that we're starting to open up businesses, and we have our roadmap, and we also know through our own CMI research that 2/3 of people in the UK have felt more stressed since the restrictions of 2020 and the pandemic, and there are myriad reasons for that we will get into. In 2020, November 2020, we did another piece of research, Management Transformed, and found that 72% of employees rated their well-being as a top priority for managers and leaders. That was the top priority. And this means that well-being is firmly on CMI's agenda, and we're encouraging other employers to do the same. Now, some studies have shown that fewer than 50%, fewer than half of all employers have a formalized mental health and well-being strategy, and yet the impact of mental health on UK employers and the economy is enormous. It costs 45 billion a year, and over 17.5 million days were lost in work-related stress, depression, and anxiety. So these are huge numbers, and the pandemic has actually made this worse. So in response to this, CMI has partnered with Kooth, and we are delighted to be announcing that partnership. And what that means is that we are offering every single CMI member and learner access to all of Kooth's mental health and well-being support, advice, and resources. And as I said, they are the leading UK online mental health platform with the mission to provide that safe, accessible care to everybody. I should caveat that we are offering these services to all of our UK-based members and learners, and there are reasons for that, which we can come on to. But now, without further ado, I'd like to start to get into the topic of today and welcome my guests, Lynne and Louise. And Lynne, I want to start with you. Our Management Transform research did show that 72% of employees rate well-being as the number one priority. Does that surprise you? And how important is it that employers prioritize this, and what does it look like?
Thanks, Anne. Hello, everybody. Thanks for having me. And yes, I guess it will not surprise you to know that as a psychologist, I absolutely think that this is super, super important for all of our employees. And I think, you know, for those of us who've been working for many years now within the mental health arena, we've been shouting about this for such a long time, really, really crying out for more of a focus on the importance of mental health within the workplace. And I think it's felt as though for many years this has been heard, you know, to a greater or lesser extent, but often falls on deaf ears. So I am delighted that we're now seeing more and more research around this topic that really highlights the importance. Why is it important? It's just the right thing to do, isn't it? You know, it's just the right thing to do. Now, I'm really interested in some of the economic figures that you quoted because, you know, rightly or wrongly, people are listening to those figures, 45 billion a year. Wow. You know, so I'm really hoping now that our business leaders see, I guess, not just mental health and mental health strategies on a par with, for example, financial strategies and financial growth, but actually see those two things as two sides of the same coin, because they are. So whatever it takes, it doesn't really matter in a way. It's just really, really important that we're talking about it now. What does it look like? Well, it depends on the service that you're in, I guess. I think, and interestingly, this came out of your research, communication is just so important. You know, I think you cover lots of sort of different industries. But one of the things that's really important is it's not so much where you work, it's how you work. It's how your employers communicate with you, you know, the emphasis that they place on your mental health and how much they empathize with you. So I think that's really important. And also making sure that the services are accessible. And I think that, you know, many organizations have solutions in place, but often they're a bit tick boxy, and that's not necessarily because people don't really care. They just don't get it. So to have a service that's going to be fit for purpose, it has to be accessible. And by accessible, I mean on a very practical level. So if, for example, there's access to mental health or wellbeing support during, you know, 9 to 5, are employees then freed up to go and access those services between 9 to 5? Do they have to then make up the time afterwards? So there's some very practical considerations, but also some of the more subtle and the more emotional ones. I think, I'm not sure whether it came out of your research, I think it may have done, that many employees, I think it's 1 in 5 managers, I think that's the number, is anxious about using in-house EAP systems for a whole host of reasons, but stigma around mental health remains. It's better, it's certainly better than it was, but there is still a stigma. And if you imagine almost the double whammy of the stigma in being perceived as somebody who then brings all your mental health problems to work, and the real, you know, perceived anxieties around being seen as a weak link amongst the service, or maybe being passed over for promotion because, you know, you've got some mental health difficulties. So that's really important. I mean, it's one of the reasons why our service is anonymous, because we recognise that that's really important. So I think they are 2 of the kind of really key things. There are some other points. I'm sure Louise wants to come in and share some views as well, but they would be my 2 number ones: communication, transparency, and accessibility of services first and foremost.
Sure, and the anonymity point that you made, also very, very important. Now, Louise, since you joined Specsavers, how have you prioritized mental health and well-being, and what have you learned, and what would you recommend to other managers and leaders and employers on the call?
Thanks, Anne. So, I mean, yeah, really agree with a lot of the points that Lynne made there, really on kind of how you make things accessible for employees. That's really, really important. But I think that the real focus that we put on Specsavers is helping our managers to feel comfortable with the conversation, because actually the kind of face of your organisation to your colleagues is their line manager, isn't it? And, you know, that's absolutely where all of their conversations and interactions happen. And I think what we've kind of found for sure, and it's human nature, is that actually sometimes we're asking the question that we don't really want to know the answer to, because actually sometimes that response might lead to us having to be in a conversation that we might feel less comfortable with. So one of the things that we're really focusing on at Specsavers is helping managers to understand how to ask that question in the right way. I mean, this particular webinar is called "It's Okay Not to Be Okay," and that is really important. And, you know, I think if we're all honest with ourselves, how many times do we ask the question, "How are you?" and we're not really listening to the answer, actually. And one of the things that we've recently done, I think, that's had a huge impact is Ask Twice. And this is, I know, a campaign that's kind of gone across a lot of organisations. So, you know, when you ask once, "How are you?" and they go, yeah, I'm okay. You know, really watch out for those visual signs that somebody isn't okay. And when it feels the right thing to do, ask that question again. Hold on a minute, you might have said yes, but I recognised in the way that you were kind of responding that you don't mean yes. You know, how are you? And I think the really important thing for us then is, how do we make our managers comfortable with something that they might not be trained to deal with? We're not psychologists, and we're not in a position where we can deal with those things, but we are human beings, and actually being able to empathise with somebody, to recognise that, and not always go straight into fix mode, because I think that is always the place that we, you know, particularly as managers, move to. So what can I do then to fix this for you? Well, actually, that's not always what you need to do. And sometimes it is just about listening to what it is that's kind of causing those concerns inside and outside of work. And I think, kind of just to pull out really what the pandemic has done is raised everybody's stress levels outside of work as well. So sometimes it is just having to listen to the fact that it's really hard having kids at home, or, you know, I'm trying to do all of these things at once and I'm not doing any of them very well. And that might be enough to help somebody through that kind of the situation they're in at that point. But I think the other thing that we're really working on with our managers at the moment, Anne, is that concept of, you know, putting your kind of oxygen mask on first, because actually if you're not well, and if you're not in a place where you're dealing with things well, or role modeling the things that you should be doing, are you taking a break throughout the day? Are you going out for a walk? Are you kind of doing all those things that you know are the right things to do for your mental health? And are you talking about them openly? And I think one of the things that really moved the dial for us kind of post-pandemic is our leaders being a slightly vulnerable and kind of recognizing that it's been a really hard period of time and talking about that really openly. So, you know, for sake of time, I think those are kind of the really three headline things: showing a side of vulnerability, looking after yourself first as a leader, but then also being really comfortable with those conversations and not trying to fix it.
So I think both of your points are excellent, both Lynn and Louise's points, and they certainly resonate with what we've seen. And by the way, we know that you have lots of questions. We will be taking questions. If you have questions, please do put them in the chat box. There's the opportunity to ask questions later on. But just to your points of what you said, certainly I am very open about, you know, I go outside every day at noon. I take my phone. I'm very open that I am breaking up the middle of the day to walk my dog. You know, I think, I readily admit when it's, you know, not a good day and it's a very long pandemic that, you know, I think that just being human, as you both said, is so important. And the importance of leaders role modeling that and admitting, you know, don't stay at your screen all day, for Christ's sake, step away, you know, is a vital point. And we really do need to be doing more of that. But of course, you know, you've both mentioned that the daily routine and the change when home working has had a major impact on the challenges that people face. Not only that we are in the middle of a health crisis and many people have lost loved ones or have sick loved ones that they can't perhaps see. They have to care for family members. They're on furlough. They face the threat of redundancy. Their children are at home, you know, being homeschooled, and they're not teachers. You know, what advice and support would you recommend for people? Lynn, maybe start with you on that.
Yeah, it's a really good question. I find questions like this really, really interesting, and I'll explain why. So I'm a mum of three. You mentioned the homeschooling. I've got three kids at secondary school, and I found myself getting quite frustrated at times at the, you know, the well-meaning, always well-meaning advice around what to do and how to manage. And often the recommendations were to recreate the structure of the school day at home. Well, that, you know, it just didn't work for me. It didn't work. You know, maybe it would have worked for one of my children, certainly not two of them. And so I say this, and I'm sort of joking, but it's really important, I think, that we take advice with a pinch of salt and we work out what is going to work for us. We just have to do that, you know, because what works for one isn't going to work for somebody else. And I think particularly if we know one thing about mental health and stress-related difficulties, it is that one size does not fit all. And that is so important. It may sound obvious, but I really want to reiterate it, because often people try these techniques that have been suggested, they don't work, and then they feel even more rubbish and even more of a failure because it hasn't worked for them. So I really want to caveat that. And the other thing I want to say is that, you know, yes, so if for example, having structure is important, then yes, of course, do what you can to recreate that. You know, try and have the breaks that you would have normally in the day. Try and have a cut off at 5 o'clock or whatever. However, you know, if, for example, actually structure doesn't work that well for you, and you've actually embraced the lack of structure at home, or the ability to be more flexible at home, and for example finish at 3:30 to sort the kids out and make up an hour in the evening, that's okay too, you know. I think in the main people have a pretty good idea of the sorts of things they can do. I think the stumbling block is often the guilt, the feelings when you're sat at home. It doesn't feel appropriate, does it, in the working day, to go and sit and put your feet up and watch Lou swimming for half an hour with a cup of tea? But it would be okay to go and find a side room, in the office environment. I think people just feel really guilty and uncomfortable in relaxing at home within the working day. So I think people need to be so much more compassionate with themselves, so much more flexible. And I think, when people do that, wow, it's just going to really change the way they manage the day. I do think we can learn a lot as well from, I sort of don't want to over psychologize this, but we can learn a lot from some of the literature, particularly the literature around resilience and coping with trauma. So we know that people can be exposed to exactly the same trauma. Some people are really resilient and manage to cope with it well, and other people develop sort of more complex post-traumatic reactions. And I'm really generalizing here to make the points, but some of the things that have been found to be really important in promoting that resilience are trying to find some kind of positive meaning in what's going on. So if being stuck at home, feels really difficult, really try and search for some of the positive meanings, because it will be there if you look for it. Humor is something else that's really important. Try and find some humor, and also trying to support other people as well. We are good at helping other people. It's a good thing to do. It's a nice thing to do, but it can also give you a lift as well. So there's some of the sort of key points I think I would.
So that is great. And, literally, go out, smell the roses, right? Somebody said to me, I didn't think I would like to work from home, but I've realized I actually do, because when I get frustrated, I go out into the garden and pull a few weeds, and it makes me feel better.
Yeah, love it.
Right? And I think you're so right. Those individual coping mechanisms, it's okay. Use them. Please use them. Go pop on a laundry. Who cares, right? It doesn't matter. You're still going to get your job done when you can get to it. It'll still be there. But Louise, you have had some real challenges. You've returned many of your managers and employees to the workplace. Can you share what you've learned in doing that and how your managers have best supported your teams?
Yeah, definitely. And I think it's worth considering that at Specsavers, we kind of have two sides to that, because we have our store-based colleagues who,
Yep.
do you know what, they were furloughed, or the majority of our store-based colleagues were furloughed right back at the beginning while we were only open for essential care. So we were purely caring for kind of NHS colleagues, essential workers, etc., throughout the first lockdown. And so the majority of our colleagues through that process in store were furloughed. But of course, in that situation, when we became an essential retailer through kind of second lockdown, our colleagues had to return to work. They'd had to get used to the fact they now were in this environment where they had to have PPE, everything had to be sanitized, their customer journey had completely changed. Every customer had to be triaged to be able to go back into our store, and all of those new protocols that they kind of had to come to terms with. So I think in the store-based kind of world, we had, probably 3 months or so back in the first lockdown when we were literally spending more money than we were making in reality, because actually we were seeing customers and still had to have our team to do that, but the volume was nowhere near what we were used to. So, that was a really difficult time for us as an organisation to know it was the right thing to be there for our customers, and particularly those that were kind of there for the rest of the nation through the NHS, etc. But in financially, that not being the right thing for us to do. So I think bringing our colleagues back to work, we really had to recognise that they had a sustained period of time when they were unconnected to the business, and we tried throughout all of that period of time to connect, of course, and a lot of that was social connection. But the business was a different place they were coming back to now. So we not only had to have a significant training plan in place, but also had to recognise that this was going to be difficult, because I was probably scared as a colleague returning to work. And so where was my outlet? Who could I talk to if I was worried about this? So I think the advice in that space, when you are bringing people back into an environment is probably different to those in the support office, but that was about training, making sure people were comfortable with the protocols, really making sure they had somewhere to go. And that worked well. We connected people with other people that had already been back in the business for a while, so they could really understand what it had been like throughout that process. We tried to recognise the things that were different, to pull those out and kind of talk to our colleagues about the things that had changed since they'd been in place. And actually, our colleagues kind of did go back into store really well after that 3-month break. And because we were then an essential retailer, our support office colleagues came back too, back at that period of time, because we were, of course, there to support our partners in delivering service to customers. But some people's job had completely changed, because overnight, actually, the purpose became very different. Our longer term ambitions were almost they were put on hold, because actually those longer term ambitions that you have become much less relevant in a short term kind of transition from a business not making any money to a business that suddenly had to see a huge amount of volume. 3 million people didn't have their eye test through the first lockdown. That backup and demand is always going to be there. So how do we then be there for our customer becomes the number one priority. So if I'm kind of working in support office on a longer term piece of work, suddenly I'm kind of repurposed. There were so many people repurposed into the HR advice line to kind of talk about what furlough was and what it meant, and whether or not we were using it in the right way, and whether we should be using it, how and exactly the things we spoke about. So people's role changed. So I think it was really important that we recognised that what people were doing every day could be different. So we spent a lot of time really going back to basics on what is our vision, ambition, purpose right at this moment in time. And I think that's really important as people bring people back into work. Have you all got a connected vision? Do you all know what you're trying to achieve? And are people and your resources in the right place to be able to deliver that? And I think that, the working from home piece, which is really relevant for our kind of support office, we are finding ways to cope with that and to make that work. And I think one of the biggest things is about staying connected. Every conversation I have with almost every member of my team is about, I kind of just miss those water cooler moments. I'm missing the conversations about Netflix. I'm missing, all of those things that you would naturally have at work, that human connection and interaction, which can have a real impact on our well-being, can't it? Particularly if you live alone. And I think that's something that we probably need to recognise. There are some people living alone, working from home, unable to socialise outside of work. And so we kind of create this opt-in, opt-out relationship from a connectivity perspective. And my team particularly are more connected now than we know more about each other. We've seen into our homes, we've met our kids, we've met our puppies, all those things that are kind of happening that wouldn't happen if you were in the workplace. So it's a different type of connectivity, Anne, but it's still a connectivity that I think it's really important to make sure that you get. And we use technology to do that, to bring people together as informal meetings where you're not allowed to talk about work, but you can do that in different and much simpler ways.
Yeah, and I think a lot of what you said there resonates. I mean, those informal connections we are seeing into people's homes. Okay, I have my CMI screen behind me, but I can see into both of your homes, and that's very important in this sort of informal chat. And I've been having chats with people, not about work, just asking open-ended questions. And it's really interesting what you say about teams feeling they've gotten to know each other better. So there are some silver linings. And I hope that some of those silver linings continue in how we work. But still, the mere facts are, and I know you know this, Lynn, you've mentioned it, that the mental health issue in this pandemic has gone through the roof. The stats that you have demonstrate that. And you may want to share some of those with us. But really, what are the signs that managers need to be looking out for to see and notice that someone is feeling stressed or struggling?
Yeah, certainly. We've seen around a 70% increase in terms of adults presenting to us for help, and they present with a whole host of issues. We have a cohort of people who perhaps had some existing difficulties, mental health and stress-related difficulties that worsened during the pandemic, and then a whole new cohort of people who've never really experienced anything, like this in terms of the levels of stress. So we're seeing, different groups. Stress and anxiety is always the number one presenting issue for us, always. And it's in relation to a whole host of things. For example, we saw an increase in, as you might imagine, health-related anxieties, both in terms of people worrying about their own health, but also the health of people around them. And obviously worries to do with finances. Different industries have been affected to, a greater or lesser extent. Some people have lost their job and obviously income then altogether, which is very stressful. And many people have just been living with the constant threat of redundancy. So I think that fear of the unknown has been really understandably troubling for people. In terms of the signs, there are many signs. Mental illness generally is complicated. There are so many different interrelating factors, and it can be really, really difficult to try and disentangle those factors. And of course, mental health, and there are different schools of thought on this. I'm definitely of the school of thought that mental health is on a spectrum. We're all on that spectrum for all sorts of different things, whether it's anxiety, low mood, anger, whatever. We are on that spectrum. And we move along that spectrum according to what's going on in our lives. Some of the key indicators, and most people will be familiar with these sorts of things. So increased irritability is a good one. I think, within the workplace, real difficulties in making firm decisions. That's another strong indicator. Just general worries about things, sort of over worry about things. Physical health indicators is usually a big sign, because as we know, people are generally much more readily prepared to talk about headache, backache, all sorts of physical pains than they are their emotional pain. And I just to Louise's point earlier on, actually, interestingly, before I became a psychologist, actually, I was a suicide prevention trainer, and there was this big myth at the time that if you ask somebody, if they're contemplating suicide, that's a real sort of no-go, because either you'll put the idea in their head or you'll open up this can of worms. And these myths are really being dispelled now. It is really important that we ask these questions. There's a way of doing it, but it's really important that we open up the conversation. But what I would say in terms of the symptoms, yes, there are all these sort of key indicators. Some of them we can't see so well, of course. Sleep difficulties is a huge indicator of stress. We can't see that, but we may pick up on it if somebody's appearing tired at work, or they're perhaps telling us that they're feeling increasingly tired. We may want to follow that up with a question. But what I would say is, and I think this is the most important thing for people to hear, is that it's the change in presentation that's the key indicator, in whatever direction that might be. And that might sound really obvious, but I do think that sometimes it goes unnoticed depending on the direction of the change. So for example, if you've got an employee who's a really high performer, really engaged, really efficient, churns things out quickly, very vocal, joins in with things, and then they suddenly change in the opposite direction, it can become really noticeable and often more concerning for managers and leaders. But if you think about the change in the opposite direction, somebody who's speeding up, they're doing more, that can be seen as a really positive thing. Maybe not. We know that for many people who are under stress, putting themselves under stress, really anxious that they're not performing, to the extent that they should be doing, they often put so much pressure on themselves that they overcompensate and then start doing things sort of quicker and more efficiently. But actually, it could be masking a whole host of underlying worries and symptoms. So for me, it's the change. It's the change that we should be alert to and starting to ask those questions. And another thing that I would stress in terms of, I said it's important to ask the questions, and I think it is. I would again draw from some of the literature around, in particular, adversity in childhood. So many years ago, there was a real focus within sort of medics and the world of psychiatry in asking people what's wrong. Now, that may seem like a perfectly acceptable question, and it is, but the question, what's wrong, can often lead to a very defensive response. Well, nothing's wrong. Well, I don't know, you tell me. It doesn't often go anywhere. Whereas when you change that question, and a few years ago, it's been sort of quite a big shift over the last sort of 10, 20 years. If you just change that question and say, what happened? It opens up a whole different way of communicating. And for years and years and years, people were living with trauma that was, never sort of uncovered because nobody really asked the question. They said, what's wrong? With a big focus on symptoms. So it's really subtle, but it does make a difference. So if we, rather than saying to people, what's wrong with you, you're not yourself, if you just say, what's happening with you, what's going on, what's, going on in your life, straight away, I think it opens up a whole different dynamic. That doesn't mean to say, to Louise's point, which is a really good point, that you should then feel that it's your responsibility to solve it. It might be that all that's required is a conversation. People often breathe a real sigh of relief that they've had a bit of a moan. They've talked about their struggles, maybe, had a bit of normalizing. This is why peer support is useful, because people realize that they're not on their own and other people are going through very similar things. And that might be enough, and it might be that regular checkups with sort of peers is sufficient. But for those people who need something, in addition, maybe some specialist professional help, as long as you've identified it and you've spotted it early, by noticing the change, you can then plug them into the help that they need.
Yeah, there's some great pointers there. And I love that shift about what's happened rather than what's wrong, and looking for the change. Now we're going to get to questions in a minute, and I know there are lots of them, but I want to ask Louise, in your experience as a manager, what are the two main top tips you have that have worked for you to identify and support people who may be struggling with their mental health at work?
I think, one of the big things that jumps out at me that I do regularly with my team is I kind of ask them throughout my one-to-ones with my team and their team beyond that, on a scale of 1 to 10, how happy are you right now? And that is, that question opens up so much for us through my one-to-one. And that's probably, I guess, my top tip. And we often hear a 6. Okay, what is it that's stopping you from being a 10 is just the best follow-up question ever. And actually it really helps people to think, well, hold on a minute, what is it that's making me kind of me go through that? And I sometimes get the response, if you'd have asked me this yesterday, I'd have told you I was a 9. But actually overnight or throughout this last kind of, few hours, this has happened and that's made me feel this way. Which just really gives you the opportunity from that point to go, okay, so, why did it make you feel that way? And how can we kind of move through that? And I think it just gives you the best gauge. It's better than any kind of talent grid I've ever worked through. It gives you an idea of where people are sitting at emotionally throughout that process. So I think that's kind of, I guess, top tip number 1, scale of 1 to 10, how happy are you and how can we kind of work that through? I think the top tip number 2, from my perspective, is going to be just simply about having regular conversations. So that scale of 1 to 10, how happy are you, is definitely something I have regularly. But sometimes those conversations are just, how's it been this week? Is there anything that I can support you with? What are you finding frustrating? What's really working well for you? So I think it's continuing to talk has to be the overlying thing that just makes that work for me and my team. That's the top tip I'd give.
Absolutely. And that takes us back to where we started, where actually Lynne mentioned our research, which, again, found communication, genuine communication is so important. So thank you for that. Well, we've got loads of questions. Our first one is from Adam. I loved Louise's point about putting your own oxygen mask on first as a leader. How do we help those leaders who don't know how, given that this could have a wider impact on their organizations? Well, Louise, let's start with you and then move to Lynne.
No worries. Well, I think one of the things that we do is, and this is, again, something that is probably a formalized way of doing it, I guess, but we've got some principles that we follow as a leadership team and that we want to see kind of progressing through our organization. So for example, we'll have we've in the past had no email Tuesday. So do you know what? Today we are not communicating by email. And let's just all do that and all recognise that and pick each other up when that's not happening. We have Walking Wednesday, so we have everybody should get out, post their pictures, communicate together. And I think there are things that can be done. It's always about your leader. And there's someone in that chain that needs to be demonstrating how that works. So it is about helping them to understand the things that just could make their life a little bit better and a little bit easier to cope with. And then in turn, when that's not working for them, recognizing that. We had a great session a while back where one of our HR directors just said, look, I'm going to give you a bunch of questions and I want you to score yourself on a scale of 1 to 10 on how well you do this. And they picked out some things. An example of those is how often do you get into the fresh air or do the thing that you love throughout the week. How much alcohol do you drink throughout your process? There's kind of a whole number of questions, and we were all scoring ourselves throughout the process. And then we were just asked to look at those where you had a low score and those where you had a high score and share with other people around you and put into breakout sessions to talk about what you wanted to do about that. And that is a really simple and practical way of just sharing the ways to make yourself better in a current situation. And I think, everything that we put focus on at the moment in Specsavers is about that early intervention. You mentioned it, and it's so important that we recognise when things are starting to feel not right for us from a mental health perspective. Obviously, of course, it's right for the organisation to have that support in further down the line, which we, of course, have. But it is about early intervention for us at the moment. And I think that was a great practical way that we kind of started leaders having a good conversation about what do you do and what should I be doing in that situation? And how can I then role model that on to the rest of the organisation?
Well, and the leaders themselves answering those questions too, not just asking their folks to do it and maybe share it. So Lynn, anything to add to that? How do we get leaders to put their own oxygen masks on first?
Yeah, it's really hard, isn't it? Because, leaders of organizations feel a real sense of pressure and responsibility to look after their teams. But, mental health knows no boundaries. COVID knows no boundaries. We're all equally affected by it. So I think it's really important. I guess similar to Louise, we do the same sorts of things. So we change our meeting schedules. So instead of being hour to hour, they finish 10 minutes early. We try and put a pause on sending emails out over the weekend, for example, because even if we're choosing to do that, it sort of creates a pressure for the people to respond. So we do all those sorts of practical things, but it's about culture, isn't it? It's about culture of an organisation, and that comes from your CEO and works all the way down. And we need to practice what we preach, don't we? I think our teams are looking for evidence of that. We're really fortunate we do have a CEO who does that. But yeah, we've got to model the values of our organisation and be able to hold each other to account if we're not embedding those values. I feel really passionate about values, actually. Values need to really define your ethos, don't they? And I think it's really important that if organisations don't have this already, that there is at least one value that really demonstrates the importance of valuing mental health in our employees. And then when people are not sort of demonstrating that, it feels like a sort of professional way of broaching our leaders. Because everybody is subject to the same values. So yeah, similar things. It's tricky. We need to all stand together. I think the surveys on mental health within organisations are for everybody. They're for everybody, including the CEO. Right through to everybody else.
Well, that leads nicely to our next question from Amanda. How do we start a conversation with people who are of a higher grade position than us when we see them struggling? How do we break down that hierarchical structure to make these more human conversations happen? So how do you do that? If your boss is having a problem, how do you broach that? Louise, what do you think?
I think we have to see every individual as a human. I think it does depend on the culture of your organisation. I think we're really, really lucky within Specsavers that I guess kind of pay grade isn't seen as a barrier to a conversation. But I think just to kind of really pick out that for this individual, it obviously has been difficult in the past. My recommendation would be that you perhaps show a level of vulnerability first. And kind of talk to them about, look, I've seen this happen in certain places and it's having this reaction. Have you seen that happen, and how would you achieve that, leader? Oh, and by the way, this is how that interaction made me feel. So I think seeing them as a human, not as a pay grade or a superior, is really important. And just going, I'm kind of spotting that you're finding things a bit difficult as well. I would love to have this conversation. If you're not finding things difficult at this point, therefore you don't have that kind of, I guess, in-way or that inroad, I think, helping them to understand how perhaps some of their reactions are making other people feel, and then, signposting support where it's relevant.
That's a great point. We have so many great questions, and I'm conscious of time and getting to them all. So I'm going to just move to the next question, which I'm going to ask Lynne. It's a great question from Payman. How do I support someone where stress in their home life is affecting their work life?
Yeah, that is a great question. It's something that we're seeing all the time within our Kooth website, and it's hard for people to separate those two difficulties, particularly at the moment, and particularly when people are working at home. I think, okay, so great to be able to be aware of that and to spot that. That's the first most important thing, as we've discussed, to create an environment where people feel able to share their concerns. But I think what's really important here is that, and we've touched on it before, I don't think that colleagues should feel too much responsibility to be able to manage that. I think have the initial conversation, create some space. And I think Louise mentioned earlier that we shouldn't always be too quick to sort of jump in with solutions. Having a little bit of space just to reflect and to talk and to normalise is really important. Having said that, there needs to be a balance. If there's too much time reflecting, then you feel as though you're not actually, solving the issue. So I think this is where it's really important to have a strategy. And having a strategy means having places to refer people to. I think the difficulties for many people in the workforce is they feel like they're the only person. They feel that they've been entrusted, with this emotional information, and they don't have anywhere to go with it. And they feel sort of really anxious about turning somebody away because they're kind of going to be left to manage on their own. So that's why the strategy is really important. There needs to be a service that you can refer into. Support.
Yeah, no, in a way, what you're saying is that's where, services like Kooth come in and are important, because you can say, gee, if you're feeling, here's a service, did you know we have access to that? And you can get anonymous help, and lots of other people are feeling the same thing. It's what you said about not fixing it.
And sorry, I was just going to jump in that people shouldn't feel sort of anxious that, crikey, they think I'm being referred in for specialist counselling. Maybe not. That's one end of the spectrum. If that's going to be helpful, we do one-to-one specialist counselling, but have a whole host of things at the other end of the spectrum, a whole host of, of articles, goal-setting tools where you can set your own goals, journals where you can sort of record some of your feelings, peer-to-peer support. It's such a great, there are so many things. It doesn't have to be this specialist, one-to-one counselling support, although it could be if that's what's needed. So people need to be reassured that there are places to go.
Yeah, that's a great point. Now, there's a great question here from Jonathan, which builds on what you were mentioning just then, Lynne, and I'm going to put this one to Louise. Where's the line between empathizing with the team and business need? Accommodating many personal requests can lead to extra pressure or stress on the team or business to cover others' needs. How would you answer that? Good question.
It's a pretty fine line, but if you look really closely, I think it is there, isn't it? And actually, the conversations that we have with our team and is how will this affect your work and the way that you work moving forward? And actually, probably 8 times out of 10 we find it's not going to. Actually, in reality, I'm dealing with it and we're coping with it and it's fine. In that 2 out of 10 case where actually their workload is too much for them, or it is work that is really impacting on how they're feeling, it's about creating a plan to make that work for you and them, because it is absolutely two-sided. And I think we have a responsibility to draw back where we need to, but also to kind of set those goals to make sure that we're reaching and moving back into a place of performance over time. Because I think you're right. No business can carry people who aren't performing in their role for any sustained level of time. But it is about small steps back into that kind of routine, and what are the things that we can do to help them to do that. So the line is there, completely and utterly agree with Jonathan, and I just think it is about moving them back in that direction. And you know what, I think what we've found particularly over the last year is more of our team are seeing that at times it's them that's picking up the slack and at times it's others, because actually everybody is going through the same process at the moment. So I think people are probably more aware of why and how people are being affected by this at the moment.
Yeah, and what you both said earlier, and I completely endorse, about early intervention and small signs, small bits of recognition that it's okay not to be okay, as you rightly pointed out, this session is entitled. That helps people to recognize that how they're feeling is okay before it escalates and really hits their work. So that's, that culture point that you both mentioned, and we know from our research is so important, is another way of making sure that line never has to be drawn, or not drawn as often. So another question from Tristan. As a manager from a company with little in the way of HR and well-being checks, what first steps would you suggest could be implemented to make a change for the better? Well, Lynn, what do you think? Baby steps. What's the first step for Tristan?
Gosh, so little in the way of HR and well-being checks. Wow. So step one is to, badger your CEO and leaders in your organization to consider what the health and well-being strategy is. Then there needs to be a strategy. That's the baby steps. Start with the strategy, and then build on it. I think, this has to come from the CEO. This has to come from the leaders of the organization. I've been amazed at how many organizations just haven't really given much thought to this, and if it hasn't to date come sort of from the top down, then it's going to have to be a swell from the bottom up. I think perhaps a consortium of people need to kind of step forward and say, and give some really practical examples of the sorts of things that you're struggling with, perhaps demonstrate some areas in other industries who seem to be doing this really well. Because, I don't believe in the main that leaders of organizations don't care about this. I know that there may be a few, small examples where that's the case, but in the main, wow, leaders of organisations want a happy workforce. They do want to look after the well-being of their staff, and perhaps just haven't realised the extent to which this is a problem. The baby step is have a strategy. If there isn't one there, create a bottom-up swell to gain some momentum to get one.
That's a great point.
Okay sorry.
I would just say to Tristan, and then I'll come to you, Louise, use these stats. Less than half of employers have a formalized mental health, but it costs $45 billion a year, 17.5 million days. Well-being is the number one concern we found in our research. And then, as Lynn said, find some allies, get some practical examples, and go see the boss, right?
Yeah. Equates to £5 saved. So if it's a boss that's really, concerned about financial growth, £1 spent, £5 saved.
There you go. There's a great stat, great ROI. Lynn, Louise, you wanted to comment.
Yeah, I just wanted to kind of say, actually, I think recognizing that it's something that we should be looking at. I think one of the things when I've spoken to smaller businesses that they've kind of, which I'm assuming a business with no real focus on HR would be a smaller business. I might be making an incorrect assumption, but when I have spoken to smaller businesses and how they want to achieve this, conversations have been around actually how do we get parity between physical and mental health, rather than necessarily what's our big well-being drive. It's how do we think about the two things side by side. And if we have a physical first aider within each of our premises, why would we not have a mental health first aider? So there's a piece around, what are the small steps that we can take to give parity to those two areas? And then also, I think the second thing that could just be a really great starting point is, let's just have some great conversations, and let's just identify where we have people who might want to talk about a little bit more than they have been. So kind of one-to-one, better conversations. And actually then how do we get parity for mental and physical health across our organisation by putting in place some experts across our smaller organisation? Would be my suggestions.
So we've got about 5 minutes left. I've got two great questions I want to put out there before we wrap up. Our last question is, this question, so it's not our last question, from Dawn. In my workplace, the culture is to frown upon anyone who says how they feel if it's not a happy feeling. How does one deal with their managers treating one as if they are causing trouble by speaking up about the way they feel? Well, this is called It's Okay Not to Be Okay. So, right. Quickly now, Lynn and Louise, how do we help Dawn? What do we say?
Share the recording of this session. Seriously. Again, back to my last point, I find it hard to believe that people don't care. I think mental health and stress stories in the workplace is frightening for a lot of leaders, because they just don't feel that they have the skills to manage it. I often feel that when people express sort of anger or resistance to do something, rather than being quite an obstinate refusal, it's born out of anxiety. So I think we need to educate and relieve them of some of that anxiety to empower them to do the right thing.
Great.
And just to add to that really quickly then, because I'm aware that we're getting tight on time, but to add to that really quickly is it's choosing the right time to have those conversations. And I think often what I've seen is people bringing those examples to life in group environments or at a point of frustration, or when you're being asked to do something. It's about finding the right time to have those conversations, rather than doing those at a time when it feels like it's an obstacle to getting things done, because I think that's sometimes when there can be a frustration. Because I'm with Lynn, I don't think anybody wants anybody to be feeling in a bad place. I might be coming from a naive position there, but I think if you really said to somebody, I'm not feeling great, at the right time, at the right point, rather than at a point where they're asking you to do something and it feels like you're pushing back, that for me is choosing the right time to have those conversations.
So choose the right time to get Dawn's manager to watch this recording.
Exactly. There we go.
Right. Okay. This is now our last question for Becky. With all the pressure on increasingly leaner structures and heavier workloads, finding the time to look after my personal well-being is difficult. Are there any techniques that support positive well-being that can be practiced in a short window of time during the day? Lynn.
Oh, wow, there are loads of techniques, with the caveat, to reiterate my point earlier, that one size does not fit all. So it depends what works for you. Many people swear by mindfulness as a way to sort of calm your mind. It's not for everybody, but if you haven't tried that, there's some fantastic apps out there. The Calm app, there are many. I would recommend trying that, because you can do it in very brief pockets of time. So give that a try. If you're more of a sort of thinking person, I like problem solving techniques, which help you to get to sort of nub of difficulties and see things in a very visual way. And then back to what we talked about earlier, if going out in the garden, taking the dog for a walk, doing some physical exercise is something that helps to relieve pressure, do that. Do whatever works for you, and it's trial and error. If something doesn't work, it's okay, try something else, and you will find something that works, and then build it into your daily routine. And that doesn't matter if it's not what other people are doing. If it works for you, then then try it. Look at websites. Obviously Kooth website has all sorts of information. You can drop in, you can talk to peers, you can set goals. So use some of the services that are available to you as well.
And Louise, any advice for Becky?
Absolutely. So there's a few things I think that recently have changed my life in this front. So I would love to share them with you, Becky. So I think I don't know if those on the call are Microsoft users, but Microsoft has something called Focus Time. And if you haven't used it, use it, because actually what it does is books out time in your diary for the next couple of weeks that you have spaces for you to have focus time, where it will switch off any notifications. It will stop people from booking time in your diary. I cannot recommend that enough. Changed my life. And I think the other thing is, it really kind of aligned to focus time is plan your time, exactly the way you would plan any other time. Plan time for you to be well. I have now in my diary from 12 to 12:45 every single day without fail a lunch break, and during that time I get out and I walk. And then lastly, the other thing I think that has made a big difference is switching from using Teams all the time to sometimes using this strange rectangle thing that sits on my desk as a phone, because you can do that and be very mobile with it. I guess the clue's in the title of it's a mobile phone. And actually you can do walking meetings, you can get out, you can do all those things that people are just becoming much more accepting of now. So I think plan your time and just see it as one of your big rocks, one of the things you're not willing to give up. And I promise you, you have time for it.
Yeah, and I completely endorse that. And in fact, we have a walk and talk hour every day from 12 to 1, and actually no video, no emailing, and I get out, I walk my dog, and I take my phone. And, if I need to call somebody, I call them and I talk to them on the phone. It's fine, right? It's really easy to do and very important. Lynn and Louise, you've been absolutely fabulous guests. So many wonderful practical tips. And I know from the chat that many of you on the call have been sharing wonderful practical tips as part of this session, sharing your own tips. We are going to capture all of those and make sure that we have them. Thank you so much for joining us. I do want to reiterate that we are launching a partnership with Kooth that we're very proud of. Every single CMI member and learner in the UK will have access to Kooth services. It's live now. You can access it on our website. If you are not a member of CMI or a learner, because all our learners are members, well then, maybe you would like to become one, because in addition to all the great resources to help you be a better manager and leader, you'll have access to the UK's leading mental health service provider with loads of great resources. So Louise and Lynn, thank you both so much for joining us. All of you out there, thank you so much for joining us. And stay well, and remember to put on your own oxygen mask first. And that it's okay not to be okay. Thanks. Take care.